The Addams Family Chronicles continue. Chapter 22. You Need a Haircut. Hairstyles are as old as civilization, and the way we choose to keep our hair speaks volumes about who we are, both as individuals and as a culture. The hair care business is a multi-billion-dollar industry. We're continually bombarded with billboards, magazine ads, and television commercials that influence our perception of what style and fashion are, constantly dictating the expected norms of the culture with which we each identify. Religion plays a part, too, in the hairstyles, such as the side locks of fundamental Judaism, the long flowing hair of Amish women, the ponytails of the Hare Krishna, the tonsure of Buddhist monks. We spend so much time with our hair too. Shampooing, conditioning, brushing, drying, fixing, styling, cutting, coloring. It all adds up to a significant portion of our lives. Some might think it best to have no hair at all. But of course, for a popular 16-year-old boy in high school during the early 1970s, few things held more importance than one's appearance. This is the story of a young man's hairstyle, a father's unyielding will, and a mother's resolve in the midst of tribulation. It was the middle of August, and the fall semester was set to begin within the week. The Addams children had enjoyed a full summer of fun in Florida. While there, Dad had taken summer classes in pursuit of his doctorate in education. Although these credentials were not required for the job he currently held as a public school administrator, he felt confident that advanced training might serve as a buttress at some future time, if and when he chose to bolster his career standing. For the time being, however, he was content to serve in his second year as superintendent of schools at Waurika. His children had adapted well, despite the xenophobic culture here, and they were popular with most of the other students. And because the start of school was nigh, Mom involved them all in the requisite beginning of school routines, like enrollment, buying clothes, school supplies, extracurricular activity sign-up, physical exam for sports, and a haircut. Mom set up her barbershop in the kitchen, where the linoleum accommodated easy sweeping of the piles of hair that would soon litter the floor. The bar that separated the kitchen from the open family room served as a good place to set her accoutrements, along with the set of attachments for the electric clippers, which were perilously connected using two extension cords to a distant outlet located across the room. Perhaps, though, the condition of the clippers themselves might have been the bigger danger, as they had been in the family for as long as anyone could remember. Several sections of black electrical tape adorned the length of the clipper cord, and several of the attachment combs had teeth missing from them. Mom attached one of the more forgiving combs, then authoritatively summoned any one of the four children seated across the bar to the chair. Eric obeyed unusually quickly, and with no objections from his three siblings, he sat down as Mom cheerfully draped the plastic barber's cape around him, attaching the gown snugly around his neck with a safety pin. When she flipped the on switch, the device buzzed to life with a surprisingly well-tuned hum, and she proceeded skillfully around his head, freeing large clumps of his mane with each pass. Eric smiled broadly, conscious of the stares from his waiting siblings, and proud to be the center of the attention. At 10 years old, he was utterly naive of trendy hairstyles, and predictably held no preference for how long or short was his hair. But just as predictable, his 16-year-old brother Lynn was at the height of teenage insecurity, acutely aware of social scrutiny in all its forms. Peer pressure was the governing force in his every behavior. He mused that something like a bad haircut, whether deliberate or accidental, might place him outside of the cultural norm of his cohorts and could be viewed as a monumental breach of the unspoken fashion code to which they all belonged. This could subject him to possible humiliation and subsequent exile from the peer group, a fate certainly worse than death. Lynn stared at the growing piles of hair on the floor at Eric's feet as he ruminated on just how much vulnerability a bad haircut might pose. He decided to nip this problem in the bud. "Mom, now you know all I need is a trim, right?" The forceful way he posed the question served only to crystallize his true concerns. Mom looked up momentarily, then retreated back into her own thoughts as she continued cutting young Eric's hair. She completely understood his predicament, owing to a year of her own childhood when she was forced to wear a baseball cap to cover her head, shaved as a treatment to rid her head of lice. But she also remembered the conversation she had had with Dad just the night before, the precipitating reason for the haircuts in the first place. Dad had mentioned that the boys were looking like hippies, and that hippies were undisciplined, and that because of his standing in the community, they must not think that his household lacked any discipline. In a way, his motivations were consistent with Lynn's, only their agendas were in conflict. Mom found herself squarely on the horns of a dilemma and sought for the least confrontational language and tone she could strike. "Now, Lynn, you want to look handsome for all those cute little high school girls, don't you? They'll like clean-cut boys." She continued mindlessly cutting Eric's hair, eager to discern whether or not her words were being embraced. The others looked toward Lynn for any reaction, but he gave nothing away. At this point, he had no reason to believe that she wouldn't do her best to please him. Besides, the fashion trend was calling for longer hairstyles anyway. Short hair was a thing of the past, and only a bigot would force him to wear his hair that way. His tense expression softened a bit as he realized the folly of his concerns, and an easy smile settled over his face. "Next?" Mom dusted off Eric's neck with a brushful of talcum powder, then removed the barber's cape from around his torso. He jumped up and began dusting the hairs away in a peculiar dance, glad to be free, once again, to move about as he pleased. Lynn stood and moved across the room to occupy the empty chair. Mom swept the clumps of hair into a larger trichome pile and pushed it neatly out of the way. She grabbed the barber's cape and slung it around him, then moved to fasten the safety pin that secured the cape in place. His hair and back was even longer than she had noticed, easily falling over his collar, making it difficult to see how to fasten the pin. Finally, after parting his nape hair, she succeeded. She stood up straight and took a heavy breath. "Okay, so how about we start with the longest attachment for the sides? Then we'll blend it into the longer hair on top. I'll use the scissors up there, but we're going to have to get this long stuff off your ears and collar. If you're going to play basketball in the..." Mom stopped as Lynn interjected. "No way! No clippers for me. I'm keeping the hair over my ears. All I need is a trim with the scissors. Coach Marsh doesn't have any rules about hair length. I like it longer, like everyone else. The girls don't like that 1950s clean-cut look anymore. Only the dorks keep it high and tight. I only want a trim. With the scissors." Lynn was direct and clear in his insistence. The other children fell quiet and attentive as they waited on Mom's rebuttal. The lingering silence thickened from uncomfortable to downright tense. Mom stood emotionless in her trademark stoicism, searching for the least painful path around the impasse. She really had no strong feelings about the length of a boy's hair. Why was it even a problem? She thought about precedent, then remembered How she had allowed young Eric's hair to grow until he was almost 3 years old before reluctantly cutting it. That wasn't a problem, she thought. And by golly, the length of Lynn's hair isn't either. The epiphany arrived slowly, causing her to chuckle at the clarity of the moment. But it didn't assuage the fear she harbored, the fear of Dad's reaction to an act of perceived disobedience, the fear of his wrath, the fear of who might be the target of his anger. Okay, no clippers. She laid them down on the counter and picked up the scissors and her comb. It was a compromise that seemed to make them both happy, but the other children seemed rather disappointed that there wasn't more of an argument. As she progressed through the cut, she took as much as he would allow her to, but she continued to wonder whether it would be enough to pass Dad's inspection. She was almost finished when the front door opened, then slammed shut. Dad was home. Adrenaline flooded into Mom's bloodstream, making her a bit dizzy. Young Eric and Alicia ran to greet him. Dad, do you like my hair? Eric brought up the one subject Mom had hoped to avoid altogether. Dad grabbed Eric's chin and turned his head side to side. He nodded his head discerningly, providing tentative approval before patting Eric on the head with a chuckle. But when he saw Lynn sitting in the barber's chair, his expression changed abruptly. Mom attempted to lighten the moment by offering a positive spin on things. How do you like Lynn's hair? We're almost through here. Her voice broke slightly, perhaps the result of an aberrant beat from her pounding heart that now felt stuck in her throat. She slumped as she tried to conceal her nervousness, pretending to go about finishing up the cut. Dad walked over to the chair and hovered over Lynn's head for a closer look. Lynn looked straight ahead, avoiding eye contact, much like an army private might do during an inspection of the barracks. Almost through? Don't be silly. It looks like you haven't even started. You'll need these. Dad reached across for the clippers and handed them to Mom. Lynn's eyes opened wide as he broke ranks. Dad, we decided not to use the clippers, and none of that high and tight stuff. It's the 70s now. Things are a lot different. All the other kids... Dad interrupted as he grabbed the clippers back from Mom and moved her out of the way with the back of his arm. His demeanor changed quickly. Don't sass me. No kid of mine is going to be a goddamn hippie. Dad flipped off the attachment and turned the bare clippers on, seemingly in one fluid motion. Then put the buzzing clipper blades to Lynn's temple and shaved off his right sideburn. Lynn objected straight away and attempted to get up, but Dad grabbed him roughly by the shoulder and continued up the side of his head with the shears. A big glob of hair plunged from his scalp and glanced his shoulder before helplessly coming to rest on the top of Dad's shoe. He made a second pass around his ear, and again, Lynn struggled to get up, but Dad only tightened his grip, and another mass of hair floated aimlessly forward. The other children looked on in silent horror, as if watching a bleeding sheep being robbed of its wool. Mom, no longer stoic, pleaded for reason. Warren, stop. Please stop. But by now, Dad was past the point of rational thought. His only purpose now was the submission of his rebellious son to the iron of his will. The hair fell as silent leaves in autumn, tumbling to rest in bitter heaps beneath the chair. Lynn, far from resignation, tried his hardest not to break, attempting to display his own mettle by struggling again. But when Mom reached over and touched Lynn's arm consolingly, their eyes met, and together they realized the unfairness of this moment. A silent tear broke the border of his eye and glanced off the plastic gown before joining the drifts of hair accumulated on the linoleum floor. The hum suddenly stopped as Dad shut off the clippers. There, high and tight. Now that's the way respectable boys look. He tossed the clippers to the bar and released his grip on Lynn's shoulder before shaking off his shoes and walking out of the room. Lynn reached hesitantly for the top of his head, examining the few tufts of hair that remained. He looked again at Mom and her familiar stoic facade, and they didn't speak, but he recognized the apology in her eyes. He had capitulated, not by choice, but by force. And while his determination had remained strong, his spirit had been raped, his freedom to choose taken from him against his will. It was a seminal moment, to be sure, and would serve to influence the choices he would make for the rest of his life. Perhaps, though, Dad learned something from the events of that day, too. As if by design, from that day forward, Dad's hairstyle changed. No longer would he wear his hair short, but instead would embrace a hairstyle that was much longer than before. He began wearing his sideburns lower as his hair grew longer, over his collar and over his ears. He even dyed it as he grew older, and at times resembled that undisciplined hippie he so vocally repudiated. Maybe this was Dad's way of saying that he was wrong, a tacit signal of surrender to Lynn's way of thinking, an unspoken admission of regret for having behaved so shamelessly. But one thing is for certain. Dad said many times that the only difference between a good haircut and a bad one is about 4 weeks.